Hello, everyone. My name is Vincent Riccio, and I'm a technical marketing manager here at Broadcom. And today, what I'm going to focus on is what are we doing with VCF9 and how to consume the cloud. So, basically, what I'm going to focus on really is the automation of that private cloud investment that you made. How do you deploy your applications and services? How do you, like set up tenancy or different organizations that have different needs? All that kind of stuff. And then how do you consume that IaaS, right? Or how do you use IaaS on top of this cloud, as well as maybe some other ways that we can consume, such as anything as a service and so forth. So really glad to be here with you today. I'm always excited to do these, and I'm really looking forward to showing you kind of where we're going, what we've done recently with the product and automation, and just kind of the overall strategy that we have to help you really deliver a private cloud to your organization. So I do want to go over a couple of things first before I get into the meat of the slides. And I also want to, I'm also going to do a demo. So I'm going to go through just a handful of slides here, and then I'll show you a little bit about what we show you in the product and emphasize some of the things I'm going to be talking about. But this slide is really just kind of an intro slide that I wanted to bring up in a sense of what are some of the newer things that we're kind of doing, or what are some of the areas that we're really kind of focusing on when you think about consuming the private cloud, self-service, and automation in general. And part of that is, if we look at the bottom down here, we can see that there are services, right? Those SUDC services, things that we're familiar with, vSphere, vSAN, NSX, right? Others, we're going to talk about some other services as we go along as well. But the reality is that we're still continuing to do that, still continuing to consume that. But on top of that, what we're doing is we're introducing some new experience in terms of automation, in terms of consumption. So if you're familiar with automation today, which is the 5.2, VCF 5.2, and 8.18, there's still a path for customers to go down where they can continue that experience. And we call that organization type VMapps organization. There's two types of organizations in the product that we're going to talk about, basically tenant types, if you will. One of them is the VMapps, where customers that are existing customers will continue to have that same experience that they have today when they upgrade. There will be some consolidation of the UI and some minor differences, but the functionality will all be there. But what I'm going to talk about today really is the new experience. We have a new org called an All Apps org. This is going to be new to VCF 9. And essentially, it's very focused on the supervisor and deploying Kubernetes, custom Kubernetes objects onto a supervisor cluster or a supervisor itself, not necessarily supervisor cluster, sorry. But so the idea is you can have multiple clusters in a supervisor, and then you can start to deploy to that. So we'll get into that. So when I talk about all these pieces, some of them will bleed over into the other types of orgs, but I'm going to focus mainly on the new experience, which is the Kubernetes experience for us. So when we talk about that, one of the main things here is I want to talk about is the services. So you're going to see this a lot coming up from not only our marketing, but other things in the product is VCF services and partner services. So what we mean by that is, and you're going to see it in the demo today, I'm going to actually deploy using the VM service and VKS service. So these services are bubbled up into automation from vSphere. And essentially what we can do is we can consume them and start to deploy our applications and services. And those services could be, like I mentioned, the VM service, VKS service, be like a network service, a storage service. There's other extended services like Argo CD, Valero, Harbor, and so forth for like image registry, CD, continuous delivery, things for service mesh, things for databases like DSM for database as a service. So all these services bubble up and are easy to consume. And then partner services allow folks to build out some new stuff. We are actually doing some stuff with a couple of vendors now. So be on the lookout for that. I'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. In fact, I have a slide on it. And then blueprints. Okay, so we're continuing on with our blueprints. The main difference here with the blueprints now is that in this new experience, it will be focused on custom resource definition objects that are based on Kubernetes. So essentially, we're going to take something like, let's say, a VM operator, which is a custom resource definition in Kubernetes, and we'll deploy a VM using that. In fact, I'll show you that in the demo. So you can deploy your VMs right alongside your Kubernetes clusters as well as your containers. The other thing is workload operations visibility. You're going to notice a lot more of that in the product now. As we've gone to VCF 9, we've really spent a lot of time and effort in merging the products together and causing everything to act like a single product as much as we can. And part of that is sort of that workload operations visibility coming from the operations metrics and so forth. So you'll see that a little bit. Hopefully I have time to demo that at the end as well. And then one of the bigger new things is the tenancy and project management. right? So with the tenancy and project management, what we're doing essentially is introducing a new kind of construct that lets us sort of have this tenant methodology to create something that we call organizations. So in the product, they're actually called organizations, but you can treat them like tenants because we can do network isolation, we can do various types of user isolation, stores, like all kinds of stuff in there, and we'll talk a bit about that. And then project management as well to further isolate lines of businesses and continue on that path of sort of that tenant methodology. Governance and policy still in there, approvals, lease times, day two action policies. One thing we did introduce new, and I don't have a slide on it here, but one thing we did introduce new in VCF 9 automation is IaaS policy engine. And that's actually a policy as code engine where you can actually use validation and mission control type stuff from Kubernetes, like that form. I think they use a CEL language, common expression language, to actually build policies. So you could say, the VMs that get deployed have to have a label associated, or, a development project can't actually deploy, or namespace or project can't deploy, development clusters with more than one node and stuff like that. So there's a number of kind of policies, and they can modify those in the code right there in the product. So really interesting. The other big area that we're focused on is content management. So content management, you're going to see this in the demo. And essentially what this is a really nice way to distribute content to these different organizations. And there's two content libraries. There's one on what we call provider portal, which manages all your organizations. So kind of like your service provider type of person or enterprise IT admin that might be going in and managing all these organizations from the top level. They can actually distribute content through a content library. And then each organization can have their own content libraries where they have their own specific content. And we'll take a look at that a bit as well. And then continuing down the event orchestration and extensibility capabilities with Orchestrator and some other capabilities there as well. And then notice on the left-hand side, there are personas. And one of my slides is focused on that. And also, when we get into the product, there's different kind of experiences that different personas may have. So for instance, a user will have a different experience than like an advanced user, which will have a different experience than, like, let's say, the org admin or the enterprise IT admin, and certain in terms of things that they can do. So one of them is the end user, right? So I just wanted to preface this a bit because as we get into this new experience, different users are going to have sort of different use cases, right? And if we start from the left, that's really where we're trying to get to. It's getting these end users and developers a way to self-service the cloud through a catalog or UI and a CLI, all available. Get those day two operations in there on deployments, et cetera. Now, something that's new here is the organization admin and then the provider or enterprise IT admin. The organization admin is responsible for the tenant organization once it gets created. So they will go in and create the policies. They'll go in and set up the projects, and then they'll add the users to the organization. It'll ultimately be those end users on the left. Now, the provider, the enterprise IT admin, all the way to the right, is going to be mainly responsible for accruing the resources out of vSphere that are needed for these organizations. So they will provide quotas and resources through the supervisor zones and stuff inside of vSphere to actually say, okay, here's how much CPU memory and storage you can consume for each organization, and so forth. Okay, now I want to just bring up this. I know it's a little bit of an eye chart, but it's a little important to kind of understand how we're really architecting this new solution in terms of especially consumption and ultimately getting to where folks can start to deploy VMs and VKS clusters and then their applications. Now, I'm bringing up the supervisor pieces at the bottom here for a reason, because without that, you don't have an all apps experience. The new experience doesn't work. You have to have that supervisor already created inside of vCenter. And so once you have that, it's going to show up in VCF Automation. It'll just show up there. And then what you can do is you can start to build out regions. And regions are one or more supervisors, and then you carve out the resources from those zones underneath it. So what you're going to do is say maybe region US West has access to X amount of compute, US East has X amount of compute, and those regions span clusters, they span vCenter. So it really gives you an abstraction across your VCF fleet to consume resources and deploy onto. Now, above that, you can have an organization consuming all of that or just pieces of it. You can have an organization with one or more regions. And essentially, then that organization can consume or deploy onto those using the custom deep resource definitions for Kubernetes. Now, one space above it, which we'll get to in the demo as well, is the concept of projects. So each project will have like users and namespaces associated with them. And then those namespaces are really ultimately the endpoint or where the user is going to target when they deploy. So if I'm going to deploy a virtual machine, I'm going to pick a namespace and I'm going to deploy into that namespace. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to be able to go to that namespace using the UI or CLI and then see that VM and then edit it, make my iterative, changes and stuff like that if I need to in the code. Okay, and you'll notice a couple different options at the top. There's some where you see a VM next to a cluster, some that have the dotted line. That basically what you can do is you can create blueprints or even various other ways. But you can create a blueprint, let's say, that can tie your VM to the cluster, and you have one single app and so forth. So really nice there. So I want to just kind of bring that up a bit. I know I don't want to spend too much time on it. Then real quick, just going back to the services are essentially something new, like I mentioned earlier, but I wanted to bring this up a little bit because one thing that we really want to start, what we're thinking about in a broad direction is, hey, this is more than just, let's say deploying a VM or deploying a cluster. We really want to make consumption easy for our customers. And the one way that we can do that is to bubble up services like database services, load balancer services, networking services and stuff like that that customers can consume. So on the left-hand side, on the upper left, you'll see just sort of kind of the out-of-the-box standard services, and we're going to look at two of those, or maybe, just two of those today, which will be the VKS and VM service. Now, when I say those services, what I'm meaning is, okay, if you take a traditional Kubernetes API, we created it, like I mentioned earlier, custom resource definition around it. And in the demo, you'll see when I deploy a VM, it's actually the API version for that Kubernetes manifest is called the VM operator. That's the API version. So it's custom VM, custom Kubernetes clusters. And then there's some other services, which we'll actually deploy in the demo too, like a load balancer service, network service. So what's kind of cool about this is you can expose, your application as a using a load balancer. This can use NSX or ABI, depending upon how you created or set up your supervisor. There's also some additional services on the right that we see. So we'll see like Harbor for image registry. There's some things for service mesh, et cetera. Argo CD for continuous delivery, and so forth. And then, of course, AI services. So we're continuing to support our NVIDIA AI GPU services and stuff like that.
So a lot of talk about Kubernetes there managing within VCF Automation. I work with a number of customers who are at various levels of maturity when it comes to Kubernetes adoption. Some of them may already have a platform that they've selected. And I'm wondering, does VCF Automation have the ability to manage any other Kubernetes platforms that are, upstream compliant via API? If a customer needs to kind of do a crawl, walk, run in terms of adopting VCF features, or is Kubernetes management only available for customers using VKS for their Kubernetes runtime?
Yeah, great question. And so as far as VCF Automation, it's only VKS. If they have just a standard, download Kubernetes version out of the box, they won't really be able to manage it with the solution. Now they could use some of the built-in scripting tools to do some stuff if they need to integrate with it, but it would be custom stuff at that point. Out of the box, and what we integrate in would be the VKS cluster or the supervisor on top of vSphere.
So much like the RA automation of old, external integrations are very much possible. It's very extensible, but it's very much a DIY situation when you start talking outside of the
VM. And this would probably be even a little more DIY, just because we are a little more focused now on the supervisor itself. Yeah, a great question though. But yeah, that would be a custom kind of thing. Yeah, if they were to go down that route. But right out of the box, even on the existing organization, they won't have that ability just yet, or at this time.
With looking at those additional services, is that essentially a bunch of Helm charts that I can then deploy into my environment? Is that a good way of thinking about it, or is that even
that's a good way to kind of think about it, but that's not going to be the process here. There is a way to upload some files from the vendors if you wanted to do that, if we don't have something out of the box. But generally, most of them are going to be appliances or services that will just get installed onto the supervisor. So the supervisor will either come with it, like Valero. There's a couple other ones that just kind of get installed. Some of them will be additional appliances that get installed, and then some of them will just be services that you enable on the supervisor itself using a YAML and what they call kind of like a response file or something like that. So it's not specifically like a Helm chart specifically, but the idea is somewhat similar, I guess. But good question.
I see that you introduced the concept of a project. So, can you specify better if the project is a simple resources deployment or environment plus resources deployment or application plus environment lifecycle and resource deployment? So,
Yeah, good question. So it's really kind of it's the latter, really. So your project is going to be like, let's say the users, the namespaces are going to deploy to, and then once you create, like, let's say a blueprint, you will tie that to a project or one or more projects so you can share them as well. But you could just say, hey, this is tied to a project. And so everything that kind of then gets deployed and all of that will be revolving around the project. So once they deploy it, that deployment will be associated with the project. And then when they take their actions, everything will be kind of in that project from just a sort of like a hierarchical view.
yeah,
If that helps. That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. When you create your project and then ultimately create your namespace, you're gonna choose some stuff about how large the VMs will be, and you'll be able to choose like some constraints around sizing and VM class stuff and all that. And you'll see that in the demo too. So hopefully but did that answer your question? That kind of helped a little bit. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to jump into an organization called Acme Sales, and I'm going to log in here as the organization admin. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip the provider admin experience, but just know that the provider admin, what they did was they set up the networking and the region quota and the regions to consume stuff out of the supervisor for this particular organization. So I'm going to log in as the organization administrator. When I log in, I'm going to basically just see like how many projects you have. We have none right now, right? And just get a little bit of an overview. But what I'm going to do is let's go ahead and just start building this out. So a couple of things that we can do here when we first log in as the organization admin, I'm probably going to wind up realistically going to administer and do my LDAP and bring in my users and stuff. But what I can start doing is creating things like content. So remember earlier before I mentioned that we had these content libraries. One is in the provider, one is in the organization. Well, in the organization, I can create a content library, and this content library can be used, for folks that want to deploy VMs and stuff. This is where the VM images will come from. We can subscribe to an external content library if we want to, and that is actually a setting that the provider can do. So if you don't want your organization to be able to do that, you can restrict that. But essentially, we're just going to connect to this content library. We're going to pick a region. So I could pick one or more regions where there's storage classes here for this content. So essentially, the storage class is going to say how much consumption or how much storage can I consume. I can add multiple regions here if I want to, and then I'll hit confirm. Now, what this is going to do is this is going to give me the ability to publish content to these organizations. Again, I could do this from the provider as well, but I could go ahead and do it from here. Now, the other thing I could do then is go to my images, and I can see all my images are here. So those images could be used when I go ahead and do all my deployments and stuff like that. Now, before I create my project, okay, I want to define a couple things because I've not done anything in this environment yet, really, except probably my LDAP stuff in my content library. Now, I need to go ahead and start building some things out, making sure that's really customized the way I want it. One thing that we can do here is we can create namespace classes. So as we get into this, you're starting to see more Kubernetes type methodology and terminology as well. So a namespace class are essentially templates that will be used inside of the namespace, but these are kind of unique for us because not only can I go in and just say, hey, we're going to create a namespace class with a certain memory limit, say, you can only consume so many resources out of that region, but we can also add VM classes, which can have different capabilities. So for instance, I may just have one VM class inside of vSphere that is GPU enabled or has other capabilities that you can kind of checkbox when you create these VM classes inside of the system. And there may have capabilities that I want for that namespace. And usually like kind of the example we normally give is, GPU enabled, like if they're going to do something with NVIDIA, right? Or some kind of GPU thing. Then you pick your storage class, you can have more than one. This will just be generally how much space am I going to give this namespace out of the storage? What are they going to actually be able to do? So that'll be my default namespace. There's a few out of the box, but I'm going to just use default here. And then what we can do is go up to projects. So you just asked about projects. So here's where we're going to create a project. So before we start adding users into the system, I need to go ahead and create a project. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Call it customer portal. I'm going to add my users. Now notice there's different types of user types here. I'll just add Connie, and Connie will be a project administrator, meaning Connie can add users to this project. And then we can also add other types of users like project user, advanced user. Advanced user just sees more things to deploy from, like what we call services UI, which I'll show you here in a second, versus just the catalog, okay? Because there's also a catalog. Okay, now once I've got the project created and I've got my users in there, I can start creating namespaces. So let me kind of do this. I'm going to do one real quick, and then I've got another one that gets created. So I'm going to create this development namespace, and then essentially I'm going to go in here and just pick that default namespace class that I just created. So what that means is that any of the VM classes that I chose when I pick that namespace class just now, that will show up when folks go to deploy to this namespace. So like I said, it could be a custom VM class. It could be, something with some properties in it. And so that way I can really, get very granular on what they can do here. Then that region, like I mentioned, that abstraction across my VCF fleet. So they're going to be able to deploy to all kinds of clusters here. And then the VPC. Now, I really didn't talk very much about the VPC. We've had some integrations with the VPC historically, but this is a really new in the product in terms of how much we're using it now. So this is going to create a lot of isolation from the networking standpoint, because this VPC, we could actually connect this namespace, this particular organization or project, to transit gateways that will go up to maybe like a dedicated provider gateway, which is can be connected to a T0 and NSX. So we can really get real network isolation between these organizations. And then we just pick a zone that we want to consume from, and so forth. All right, let me just do that again, because this one just does two of them. We'll do a production one as well, because you can have multiple namespaces and each one could go to a different VPC if we have multiple VPCs. There's also a little bit more integration with the NSX with automation now. In fact, when you create one of these, when you create an organization inside of automation, it creates an NSX project. So you can go to that project and see all the VPCs that the organization is consuming from an NSX standpoint. Like you can go and look at the topology, change your connectivity profiles. And there's some things you can do in here as well around that. Okay, then we can get some information here. So let me just kind of show you here. We can go into the services. And then once we have the services here, we can see that, this namespace is available. So we just created that namespace. And so now what we can do is we can go in as the user and then start to consume some of this stuff. So let me just kind of get over there real quick. There we go. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to log in Fatme Sales as a user. So I'm going to log in as Mary, who is going to be an advanced user. And so the advanced user, remember I mentioned advanced users a little bit earlier. The advanced user will see the services and the catalog capabilities in here. So when we go to the services, we can see that development namespace that we created. I can see all the services available to me, virtual machine, Kubernetes. So let's go ahead and deploy a virtual machine. So when I deploy a virtual machine, again, I'm using that VM operator to deploy this. I can do this through the CLI as well, using a Kubernetes manifest and a kubectl command. Or I can also do this through a blueprint. But if I want to go in and say, hey, look, I want to really get very granular in how I do stuff, and I want to download the YAML, then here's how you can do it. And what's nice about this interface is that as I go through here and start picking things and changing things, we'll see the Kubernetes YAML manifest change on the right-hand side. So they can download this, reuse it, and also use it as a reference if they're building their own blueprints and so forth. I'll pick that VM class. Remember earlier we chose that VM class. So these are the namespace class. I'm sorry, these are VM classes that are part of that for that namespace. And we'll go ahead and hit next here. And then what's nice about this too is when I deploy this VM, this is actually a virtual machine. If you notice, the name of it's MySQL. We're going to actually install MySQL on this VM. But the other thing that I can do with this VM is I can add a persistent volume just like I would in Kubernetes, right? So I could come in here and add a 5 GB persistent volume. I can expose this VM as a service or an application using a load balancer. So I could come in here and say, okay, I'm gonna add SSH in MySQL ports. So now I've got the MySQL 3306 port opened up. So now I can access this from the outside world as long as I'm on a public subnet, which I'll change here in a second. And then we can start to say, okay, now this load balancer service should be out there for us to consume. Now, the other thing we've done as well is, because we're deploying a virtual machine here using this custom code, like this VM operator code right here that you see, we also have the ability to inject cloud init scripts. Now, we could do this before, but we do have some nicer ways to do it now. One is we have some guided inputs, but you can also just like hit raw configuration and then copy and paste your cloud init script here. And then it gets injected into the Kubernetes YAML script. So here I'm able to, add users, install MySQL on here, and that's kind of what I'm doing. And I'm also going to add a network interface because I want to publicly expose that load balancer service, right, using a public subnet. So I'm going to do that here real quick and just hit save, and then go ahead and hit next, and we can deploy in this VM once we're ready. Now, the thing I can do before that is I could download this. I could go ahead and download the YAML, open it up in an editor, and so forth. I can also copy and paste this into a blueprint. The other thing that's really nice about this interface too, for someone that uses it, is that when I deploy something after the fact, I can click on that VM and then see the YAML, the deployment YAML, and then edit it. So if I want to edit like a label or make some change to the Kubernetes YAML, I can do that later on. Okay, so let's go ahead and deploy the VM. Once we deploy the VM, we can see that's powered on, and we can get some information about it and so forth. And then if we go over here to the overview, then we can do the same thing with a Kubernetes service. So I can deploy a VKS cluster right from here as well using this UI. So if I go in here to create, you'll notice I can do a custom configuration, and the YAML also gets built out on the right-hand side for me, as well as some changes, some things I can do here. So I can pick the cluster class, I can pick the Kubernetes release version that I want. So if I just pick like the latest here, and then we can add labels, stuff like that. We can also do like interesting things like, certificate rotation for them. So that way they don't have to, rotate their certs for the different services to talk to each other. And then also we'll add a storage class here as well. So that way when we deploy our worker nodes and our control plane nodes and stuff, we have some options there. Now, the one thing we want to do is we'll want to deploy our control plane nodes. We can do 1 or 3 here, and then there's the VM class. So this will be not your worker nodes, but your control plane nodes. So that'll be like your etcd servers, your kube servers, all that stuff on the back end. And then we'll pick that. We'll do that stuff for, okay. And then our node pools, which is going to be our worker nodes. So we can pick, multiple worker nodes if we need that capacity. We can also pick what VM class, how big we want these worker nodes to be. So if we know we're going to, we know, hey, we don't want to have to scale out too much and all that kind of stuff, which you can do after the fact here. You can scale up these nodes if you want to, or scale out, right? Add more nodes and stuff like that. We can do that, but this is essentially what's going to be where our pods will live, right? So we'll change that to 2, and then we'll finish that. So that's basically deploying the VM and deploying a VKS cluster using the services UI. And I guess I'll pause there for just a second and then go to the catalog.
VM class, I could add GPUs into that VM class and have an AI application running on this. Not the supervisor cluster, obviously, but in the workload nodes, I could have the GPU added as well and run my AI application on this.
Yeah, right. So if we need like let's say GPU capabilities or something like that, then that would be an option, right? There's a number of checkboxes on those VMs. There's like a bunch of different things you can do to integrate in with third party or like different stuff. So you'll see all these options in there, and they'll be like, okay, connect to this and like some kind of GPU card or some graphics card or something. So there's all kinds of things you can kind of do in there. I think it connects to different vendors. And then those capabilities could just be in that class. So you could call that class like, my custom class, and it could be inside your namespace class. And then you would just use that if you needed it, right? And that could be part of your application. So it's just a matter of bubbling everything up, really, and making sure we can consume as much as possible using the UI here. Okay, so before I end it here, I wanted to go ahead and go through the catalog service. Because this is the other way to consume. So there's really kind of 3 main ways to consume. One is the services UI I just showed you. And now ultimately what I could do with that is I could go into CLI, I could start doing stuff. I just don't have time to go through the whole process of deploying everything in the CLI right now, but there is an option to do that. We have the VCF CLI, which is a very powerful plugin based system. I think it would be great to kind of do almost love to do a deep dive with anyone on that eventually, because it's really some powerful stuff. But the catalog is also still there. And we do have the ability to version control blueprints and push them to a catalog. So if your users are not familiar, let's say, enough with Kubernetes, or let's say they're not, maybe they're a little lower tech users, or you have use cases where you have more of an anything as a service type of thing, where maybe these are folks that just need to fill out a form, folks can still go in and do that. So they can go in and pick their drop downs and stuff. And we still have things like, conditional drop downs in the form, custom forms, data grids and all that kind of fun stuff as well. That they can do. They have Boolean values and stuff. So they can just go in and submit as well, and then go ahead and deploy it. Now, what we're kind of doing in this particular scenario is we're deploying into production from the catalog and using that services UI for dev. So it's kind of like, you might have some folks that are in development testing. Maybe they go and use the services UI and the VCF CLI to develop and deploy things, or develop and kind of test. And then you can take your production namespace and then, curate all of that, throw it into a catalog, and folks can just kind of come in and consume that, right? So that's kind of one of the ideas here. And then what they can do is they can, kind of go into their deployment that they did and see the topology of their deployment. So this is if you went into the catalog and deployed it from a curated blueprint, and for more of your just general users. And what's nice about it is they can kind of see all the objects that get deployed, take any potential day 2 actions, and then see if there was any errors or anything that showed up when it got deployed.
This could be an internal developer platform kind of user interface. This strikes me as a way for a platform engineer to start delivering that IDP environment for their developers.
Yeah, for sure. In fact, I see that's probably a great use case here. As I use VS Code, I use other things a lot, but I really kind of like this interface. I've liked the workflows. And it's really nice to be able to switch between namespaces very easily and see all the objects in those namespaces, because I have a drop down there with all the namespaces I'm working with, versus having to go in and use commands all the time. So that has been pretty nice. And then also, because we have the different personas, you can curate that content, create that platform, and then users with different roles come in and just request it, right? So that is really, in fact, I've had some customers in the past call this a developer portal. Because they're essentially looking at that and saying, here's all the services. Now, as we introduce all these other things, like I mentioned, Argo CD, DSM, for database as a service, which you may learn about in some of these other sessions potentially. But all those things will be bubbled up too, and getting bubbled up in the product. So that'll be very interesting too, because then you can really deal with everything from your infrastructure to your backup to your security to your image registry to your continuous delivery and so forth and so forth. And so it really does become a great way to sort of do that PaaS, CaaS, and IaaS type solutions.
Where is the source of truth of every action you are doing here in this, this automation? Is inside platform,
like
or is able? Okay, or we are able to export or integrate with a control version or stuff like that.
Yeah, no, great question. So a couple of things on that. I guess you're thinking about audit trail, or hey, what are people doing in the system? How do you track that? How do you track things that happen in the system? Yeah. Great question. And so there's a couple of points during the setup of all of this where it's going to ask you where to send logs for like networks and other things. However, there's really nice log insight integration into this. So when you have the whole VCF platform, one is each individual product will have their own events and tasks and audit section, usually, right? Automation does, operations does. Inside of automation, there's events and tasks, there's audit sections where you can get quite a bit of info in there. But we also send everything to Log Insight. And Log Insight is one of our log tools that we've had for a long time, but it's a really, really great, powerful logging tool that can really help you track and trace a lot of things that happen. So, for instance, like if you have a service account or anybody going in and doing stuff inside of VCF Automation, you can track that inside of the Log Insight logs and really do your analysis there. Otherwise, I've also just used the internal audit and events and tasks and stuff like that. In fact, each portal type has it. So if you're in the provider section of the product where you're really managing like an enterprise IT admin, managing all the organizations, you have an audit trail and events task there with logs going out, and each organization will as well. So there's quite a bit there from that. And then there's also the integration with the operations tools, which also gives you capabilities of like alerts and config drifts, as well as a lot of auditing there as well, and especially around compliance and stuff. So yeah, I hopefully that answers it, but there are ways to do that in terms of inside the product as well. All right. Well, if there's no more questions, I appreciate everyone's time. I really thank you for hanging out, and hopefully this was helpful for you. Thanks.